Cool. I'm not going to give a whole lot of context for this because this essay mostly speaks for itself, but I will say I wrote it a couple of semesters ago, actually for a composition and rhetoric class as a travel narrative. And it was originally, I didn't really have a point for when I first wrote it. The first draft of it didn't have a whole lot of, it didn't really have a thesis, which is not the way you should write an English paper. But I think that as I continued thinking about Charleston and pondering Charleston, because that is where I'm from, I've spent the past few years thinking about its history and its culture and the different segments of society. Pardon me, yes ma'am. Yes ma'am. The different segments of society, and how even though we cross paths a lot, there is still a lot of segregation. There's a lot of different cultures that don't really interact. And so I think that was a lot of what I was thinking about when I was writing this and writing about the history of Charleston. So the narrative, or the essay, is called The Charleston Mystique. Charleston is known as the Holy City, a moniker whose origins are apparent from one glance at its skyline. Steeples constitute some of the highest architectural structures in the city, and in the central part of the town there is at least one church on every street. It has been a favorite pastime of mine to wander through the graveyards of these old sacred places, making note of unique names and piecing together the subtle intrigues of historical figures' lives. One learns a lot about a city from its dead. The entrance to one secluded gravesite carries a sign that reads, "There is no ghost here but the Holy Ghost." All of the great families of old are buried side by side in the same crowded lots. There are emotional epitaphs gracing the stones of pious souls, strings of surnames denoting aristocratic alliances, infant graves marking times of tragedy, and family monuments that, either by word or silence, hint at age-old interfamilial drama. The more grave sites one visits, the more one begins to recognize important family names. Yet, only the names of the masters remain, the names of the wealthy or of those whose lives must have then have seemed most important to the makeup of the town. My family moved to Charleston when I was 3. It's the only home I've ever known. The first clear memory I have of visiting downtown Charleston, I could not have been older than 6. My father had to visit the old exchange building for work, and the rest of my family accompanied him. We waited outside the building while he conducted his business, and I admired the striking blue uniforms of the reenactors guarding the door. I asked to speak to them, thinking they would stand at faceless attention like the Queen's Guard, and my mother assented. Much to my shock, they did speak. They were friendly fellows who took the time to explain a little of the building's history to us while we waited. The old exchange was a central component of Charleston. It was used for town councils when first built, and during the war, when the British swept through South Carolina, it was notoriously converted to a provost dungeon for revolutionaries. It was also an important site for the slave trade. When public slave trade was banned in the mid-1800s, the little plot of land between Broad Street and East Bay became the private ground that allowed for continued auctioning of African slaves. I was relieved when the soldiers assured us the dungeon was no longer in use. But, one of them whispered, they say that the ghosts of the soldiers who died there still haunt the dungeon to this day. They smiled as my eyes grew wide. Even now, I shiver a little when I walk past the provost dungeon and wonder whether the ghosts of the slaves also cry out from the unhallowed ground. Despite the fact that my family has lived in the greater Charleston area for most of my life, we rarely went downtown when I was younger. We drove there occasionally in the summer, sticking only to the central roads, but we rarely walked except on the Battery. It wasn't until I was in college that I began to visit the downtown area with greater frequency, shopping with friends on King Street, picnicking on the Battery, or awkwardly photographing cobblestone streets near the old slave mart. Try as I might, I never loved the city as much as they did, or at least I never understood its allure. Its history fascinates me, but I do not feel entirely at ease amid the crowds of tourists and mazes of cluttered shops. Many of my relatives who never had the means to immigrate from the upstate envied my family's proximity to what they considered authentic Charlestonian culture. As far as I'm concerned, it has never been something to aspire to. Years went by before I had a way to understand or express the feelings I had for Central Charleston. For all its quaint beauty, it somehow disconcerted me. I found the words in December of 2017. A group of friends asked me to join them on an excursion to some shops on King and Market Streets, and though I couldn't afford to spend money at the tourist traps, I jumped at the prospect of companionship. We parked at an alcove on Lower King, grabbed Starbucks lattes, and commenced our spree. Wandering from store to store, my friends tried innumerable free samples and occasionally purchased trinkets. Try as I would, I couldn't join their merriment. Everywhere we walked, on every side, there were myriads of tiny shops crowded so close together it made one feel claustrophobic, each cluttered inside with overpriced stuff that nobody needed and everyone bought. But it was authentic. It was aristocratic. It was Charlestonian. We chanced to stray into the Belmont Charleston place. The hotel celebrates itself as a home for all that is best and most cosmopolitan of Charleston living. Leonardo DiCaprio made the local news once for attempting to stay there incognito. Didn't work. Brass-covered walls, marble floors, and a high-end bar are among the first things visible from the doorway, and I was instantly aware of my threadbare jeans and torn purse when I spotted the blonde lady ahead of us wearing Prada. The shops at Belmont are among the most frequented establishments for the wealthy. My group beelined for the Godiva chocolate store, while the lady ahead of us wandered into Scatel. In the reception room was a gilded throne onto which a man ascended to have his shoes shined. But when we emerged, an elderly man had settled himself down at the doorstep of the Charleston place with an emaciated dog, holding a sign that read, "We'll work for food." When I saw him, I stood rooted to the spot, gazing at the man and his sign, and suddenly my mind grasped what it had struggled for years to articulate. Charleston is still a slave to its past. It is still divided between the wealthy and the weak, the powerful and the lowly. People who visit the historic downtown area of Charleston for the first time are directed to such sites as the Calhoun Mansion and the Battery. They are asked to admire the exquisite and quaint beauty of Rainbow Row and the Gothic revivalist charm of the French Huguenot Church. They meander from shop to shop, searching for an authentic Charlestonian cultural experience, forgetting that authenticity does not lie in tourism and luxury. To truly experience Charleston requires experiencing both the past it speaks for and the past it doesn't. It requires both talking with the costumed soldiers who guard well-preserved buildings and acquainting oneself with those who lie in ancient graveyards. It requires walking with a tour guide in the footsteps of George Washington, and it requires straying from the beaten path to find the scarred and uncommemorated grounds of the workhouse that tortured so many who couldn't give voice to their pain. And perhaps most importantly of all, it requires introspection so that regardless of altered circumstances, we do not conjure back the ghosts of our past. One thing is certain, for a place so materialist and yet so destitute, Holy City seems an odd christening.